So how she transformed herself was, again, really quite remarkable. She did this, as I mentioned, through the protocol that is the topic of this webinar, intermittent fasting. And she began it again about now close to 20 months ago. And you can see already what kinds of transformations have continued. There were some nutrients that she used, and there was another type of exercise. It's really not anything new, but it was an idea of strategically timing her exercise while she was fasting. Well, I have to be honest with you and tell you that the reason why I know CM so well is that she actually is my wife of 25 years. I have seen and witnessed all of these transformations with my own eyes, and I can tell you that she deserves the credit for this transformation, certainly. But she also knew that I was very interested in how nutrients affect the brain, and it wasn't until we really had a long discussion about changing her focus, not from losing weight, but from the perspective of improving her overall health, where we began to see the transformations occur. So, what is intermittent fasting? What does it really mean? I mean, is it simply just a period where you don't eat and then gorge out? Certainly not. Intermittent fasting is a pattern of eating that alternates between predetermined and strategically timed periods of fasting and non-fasting. It has a very interesting history, and it really evolved from early studies back in the 20th, earlier this century, where a protocol called caloric restriction was examined. And caloric restriction, as the name implies, is a protocol by which animals, and usually we're talking about mice and other experimental animals, are fed a diet that's slightly below their metabolic requirements. And a number of interesting things happen over the long run. Uh, Caloric restriction has been examined in humans, and indeed there are many groups existing today that continue to practice caloric restriction. But the problem or the challenge is that it's not very sustainable over the long run. And so intermittent fasting was really proposed as a strategy, an alternative strategy for obtaining the same kinds of benefits that you would see with long-term caloric restriction. The difference, of course, is that with intermittent fasting, as the name implies, you do break the fast at predetermined periods of time. What's common, or what I think the most important point to understand about intermittent fasting is that the focus is on when to eat, not on what to eat. So a common question that comes up is, what do I eat, and what kind of diet I follow? And I'll give you some advice about that, but I want to start off by saying it's really a focus on timing rather than on nutrient composition. Although I will tell you that, again, the intermittent fasting and caloric restriction do not encourage you to go out and binge. And that reminds me about another point. If you have ever had a problem with any sort of eating disorder, intermittent fasting and caloric restriction are probably not going to work for you. The other thing that I would mention is that if body composition or weight loss is one of your goals, as it is, I imagine, for most people watching this webinar, I have to tell you up front that intermittent fasting, at least the evidence that is available now, is no better than any other traditional routine of diet and exercise. It does have some advantages, in my opinion, but there really haven't been enough studies that look at intermittent fasting in humans and compared it to traditional diet and exercise. So just by my own experience and in my experience in researching and observing what this has done, the weight loss is there. It does take work there. It is not a magic bullet. Uh, the timing of meals optimizes how our bodies were evolved to metabolize nutrients. And what I mean by that is that if you think about it for a second, for most of our time as a humanoid species on Earth, we have not had three square meals. It was very often the case that we would go for periods of feasting and then through periods of famine. And this is simply a result of the fact that we were a hunter-gatherer species and we had to hunt down our food. And when we were unable to capture our prey, we simply didn't eat. So intermittent fasting, in a sense, is really closer to the way that our bodies were evolved to store nutrients. That is to say, we weren't always constantly fed. And our bodies over evolutionary time became very effective at storing fat and using available energy sources such as glucose. So when we begin to practice intermittent fasting, we really begin to shift our metabolism to a way that it was evolved uh, to run optimally. Well, let me tell you about some of the benefits of intermittent fasting, because after all, this is the reason why we would want to do this. So, a number of studies have shown that both caloric restriction and its variant intermittent fasting have resulted in a number of positive health benefits. These include reduction of blood pressure, reduction of blood lipids or blood fats, and importantly, a reduction in inflammation. And what I mean by this is a reduction in inflammatory markers that are in our body that indicate chronic inflammation. There's a group of chemical signals in our body called cytokines. And some of these cytokines increase inflammation and others decrease inflammation. And what's been shown in both caloric restriction and intermittent fasting is that our body's ability, or I should say our body's production of these inflammatory cytokines is significantly reduced while intermittent fasting or practicing caloric restriction. And this in turn results in a number of other health benefits. What's increased during intermittent fasting are fat burning, which is obviously a good thing. Also increased is the production of growth hormone, and also, and this may be somewhat paradoxical, an increase in our metabolic rate. And here it is where we begin to see slight differences between caloric restriction and intermittent fasting. You see, with caloric restriction in the long run, sometimes what is observed is that individuals have a decrease in their basal metabolic rate. Well, with intermittent fasting, we really don't see that. In fact, in the short term, metabolic rate has been shown to increase slightly. So increasing metabolic rate while fasting is certainly possible as long as the fast isn't any longer than, say, 36 hours. Another group of improvements that we see are obviously better control of appetite, and this occurs largely as a result of the fact that we get better at distinguishing between physiologic hunger from psychological craving. And as we begin practicing intermittent fasting, we tune in to the subtle cues in our body that tell us that we should eat. And with some mindfulness applied, we can really begin to tease out what a psychological craving is from a genuine signal of hunger. So intermittent fasting, as I'm proposing it today, really does help us to regulate our appetite over the long run simply because we're better tuned in to cues both in our body as well as in our environment that tell us about when to eat. Another interesting feature about intermittent fasting is that it improves blood sugar or blood glucose. In studies that have been done on intermittent fasting in just about every species examined so far, we see improvements in energy utilization and efficiency in glucose uptake. So with humans, we know that short-term periods of fasting have been associated with better blood glucose control. Another area of benefit is in this brain process called neurogenesis. And neurogenesis is simply a term that we use to describe our brain's ability to generate new neurons and new connections between neurons. Uh, anytime we subject our brain to just a very slight stress, whether it's a stress induced by hunger or a psychological stress, there is evidence that sometimes our brain responds to this stress in a positive manner by the production of certain growth factors like brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF for short. And the point is that with just as with the slight stress to a muscle and how we know how stressing a muscle slightly can induce growth, so too can fasting induce a slight stress to the brain that encourages the production of new connections among existing neurons. So neurogenesis is something that is, or I should say, has been observed with animal models of intermittent fasting. I think mice are probably the most studied species. Uh, we have yet to see definitive evidence that neurogenesis is increased with intermittent fasting in humans, but a similar process occurs with aerobic exercise, and we know very definitively that aerobic exercise increases both neurogenesis and neuroplasticity in certain parts of the brain. And it's believed that aerobic exercise is another form of physical stress, is very similar to the kind of mild stress that is introduced by intermittent fasting.